Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives, episode 150. My name is Heidi Kuda, and today High Fidelity and I have the pleasure of interviewing the award-winning journalist and author, Jen Stout. As a young girl growing up in Scotland, she dreamed of being a war correspondent, and she made it happen. She just wrote a book, an incredible book, called Night Train to Odesa, covering the human cost of Russia's war. And she's going to tell everybody why it is so important to pay attention to Ukraine and support Ukraine, because next it could be us. Have a listen. Oh my gosh, Jen Stout, I'm so pleased that we are introducing you to our viewers today. You are an award-winning journalist and author, and we got to meet at the Byline Fest about, I think, 2024. We have a mutual in common, Zarina Zabriskie, which I'm sure we will talk about. But we are here to talk about your book, Night Train to Odesa. And I would love very much for you to be able to give our readers a summary, because your background's interesting. You've gone to all these different places, including Russia, and you begin by telling that story, Russia to Romania, and start wherever you like. But I'd love to kind of get a sense of your journey.
Yeah, it starts in Russia. I like to quip that that's appropriate because Russia started it. But the reason I ended up there was because of a long, kind of lifelong obsession since I was a teenager, at least, with the Russian language, with Russian history, with Russia itself, and this thankfully morphed into an obsession with Ukraine. I mean, it was
Wow.
always Eastern Europe for me. I don't know why. I always felt at home in that part of the world. I learned Russian at school, and it just kind of it's like I knew it in a past life or something. I'm not really sure what it was. I tried very hard to get there. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, when I was younger. And I greatly underestimated how difficult that would be if you don't come from money, frankly. Because journalism is so difficult to get into now with the unpaid internships and these master's programs and what you got to go and live in London, like how. And it just seemed to me such a closed shop. I really struggled with getting in for a long time and things kind of got in the way. But I eventually worked at the BBC and then I ran away to go to Moscow on a fellowship, and that was November 2021, which was not a great time to be going to Russia in any way.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was on a fellowship, it was the Alpha Fellowship, and I know we were sort of studying like a bit of Russian language, a bit of Russian history, but it was wildly dogmatic nonsense by that point. And I wasn't having a great time, fair to say. I never want to set foot in Moscow again, to be honest. And when the full-scale invasion started, February 24th, 2022, I was in Siberia, which was also unfortunate because it was a very long way from everywhere. And we just landed actually in Gorno-Altaysk to go on this kind of program trip together, which I hadn't thought was a hugely good idea. And it was literally like that morning that we landed on the plane, getting off the overnight plane from Moscow, sort of, I mean, it's like 9 hours because the place is enormous, right? And I remember like so vividly standing, coming out of the plane, and it's surrounded by like mountains and snow, and there's this tiny little airport in Gorno-Altaysk, and I turned my phone on. And we'd had a kind of trepidation, the feeling that there was something going to happen. I mean, everyone did, right? But I at least was very naive, and I didn't think there would be a full-scale invasion. I thought they would invade further into Donbass, more fool me. So I turned on my phone and it was my friends in Ukraine saying, Jen, they're bombing us with warplanes. And I just stood there for a second, kind of frozen to the spot, thinking, what? It just took me a minute to actually understand what this meant. And then I really wanted to leave Russia as soon as possible. It took us a few days. And then I was very thankfully out via Istanbul. I went to Vienna to see a Ukrainian friend. Actually saw Serhii Ploki by chance. He was giving a talk at the IWM that night. And then I went to Romania and reported on the border for a bit and then into Ukraine. And it's been probably the greatest pleasure of my life to be covering the war in Ukraine for the last few years on and off.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Before we get to that, I would love for you to give our viewers kind of a snapshot of Moscow. And I bring that up because many of us grew up with a romanticized notion of Russia. You read the books, see the movies, Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago,
Hmm.
Dostoevsky, you have all this richness. And what was the reality in 2021 when you say you never want to step foot back in there? What was your experience?
It's quite a paranoid situation. I would say.
Mhm.
And we'd actually had counter surveillance training before we left, I remember. And I thought maybe that's a bit over the top, but like I was under no illusion about what kind of country this had become. And I mean, the reason I wanted to be a journalist was partly because I'd read so much of Anna Politkovskaya's work when I was a teenager in school. And, you know, her covering the war in Chechnya, the way that she did it without a lot of ego, she wasn't kind of, oh, I'm going in to save them. She was just like, I kind of have to do this, probably going to get me killed. And she did it anyway. And I remember at that age thinking, that's what I want to do, discuss.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And the investigative side of things, I always love that part of journalism, which is so little of that you get to do in jobs nowadays. It's hard for me to do that at the BBC, for instance. You just don't have time. So I had some idea, some romanticization about that industry and about that. But I knew exactly, everyone knows who killed her. I understood what Russia had become. Um, and living in Moscow at that time was kind of insane because, you're surrounded by people, expats, like
Right.
Americans and Brits and some Europeans. Um, and they're kind of living the life of Riley, some of them. And they can kind of see they just don't see the same with rich Russians, right? You can live a life where you don't see the riot police, you don't see, the troops building up on the border of your neighboring country, you don't see the rhetoric because you're just like blinkered. And you're enjoying that great trade-off they had in Moscow where things, they got nice parks and yoga and sort of nice coffee shops in exchange for political nothing. And
Wow.
being surrounded by that, I just found it really, really uncomfortable. It's also, I mean, it's a place of massive inequality, and people seem to feel comfortable with an economy that runs on, or at least within the city, on these like delivery bicycle drivers from Central Asia being treated like absolute
Wow.
crap, and having pretty terrible lives, and you're getting your ice cream delivered at 3 in the morning, and I just found it really morally like, oh. Yeah, I did not enjoy being there. And I was paranoid about who I was speaking to, who I could trust, to be honest, by that point. Maybe I was right to be, maybe I wasn't. I mean, I wasn't particularly interesting to them. I certainly couldn't do any journalism because nobody really wanted to have anything to do with with me at that point because of like, again, the foreign agent stuff, which I understand. So I wasn't sad to leave. I was very happy to leave, and I was in a hurry to leave, to be honest. I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that I would, on any day, rather be in free Ukraine under the worst shelling than spend a single second in Moscow again.
Thank you so much for that. All I know about the more modern period of Russia is what I read in Peter Pomerantsev's books, and he cut out, more than a decade ago. So to have sort of that current observation is really, really valuable. And for those who don't know, the reporter that she was just referencing, Anna, won a million awards, and she was assassinated on Putin's birthday 19 years ago. So it was basically 19 years ago last week, which is just an incredible tragedy, and nothing really was done. And so here we are,
Mm.
we're watching reporters get arrested in America right now, and a reporter was hospitalized in America due to ICE aggression a couple weeks ago. And this is very, very real. And I know when I got into reporting, in the mid 80s, it was like cops and firefighters. You had a duty, you wanted to report truth. It was this service to the community. A lot has changed, but it sounds like that is still something very valuable to you, which brings us to your book. And tell us kind of wherever you want to start. I think it's incredible that you ultimately did become a foreign correspondent.
Yeah, it probably is. I'm quite a determined wee person. Yeah, I could have gone home after Moscow, but I really didn't want to. I'm sure you can understand, when I'd waited such a long time to go and do something. And I really wanted to go and cover the war. And I could speak Russian and I could understand bits of Ukrainian. I was very willing to learn Ukrainian, which I now have done a bit. And I thought, I went to Romania and I was there for a few weeks, and I was doing a lot of reporting at the port in Izachia, and a lot of people would speak Russian with me because they're from Mykolaiv, Mariupol, Odesa. And I was living in this boat repair workshop, thanks to these lovely volunteers who let me live in their little factory in Tulcha in the port. This is right on the Danube. Beautiful place, like, and beautiful people, do you know? I think with this kind of reporting, you end up like flung into a place that you don't know anything about and you have to learn really quickly and you're kind of at people's mercy. I didn't have any money, obviously. So I'd met these volunteers and said, "Oh, do you know anywhere really cheap to stay after a few days?" And they said, "Well, how cheap?" And I said, "Well," and that's how I ended up in their boat repair workshop. And they would feed me and make me drink plum brandy. And it was just, I think after Moscow, especially after the kind of deadening feeling of Moscow, to be in that beautiful place with people who were sarcastic about the government, who were laughing all the time. It just felt like coming out of a cave, to be honest. But all the time I was there, I was thinking, how can I get to Ukraine? I didn't want to like rush in without, because a lot of people were saying to me, you don't have any conflict experience, so you shouldn't be doing this. And with respect, how do you get the experience without going to, I don't know. But I didn't want to rush in like an idiot because that's not helpful to everybody around me. So I got some training. I finally got some body armor through various sources, and I went as far as Odessa after a few weeks. And I mean, we all know this by now, but it's that strange thing of like the front line is everywhere in Ukraine, but it's also because Russia strikes cities with impunity, but it's also sometimes nowhere. But it's sometimes not there because there's so much normality, there's so much normal life because there are so many people there and they just get on with things. So I was indecently happy to be in Odessa. I mean, I was just so delighted. I dreamed for years and years. I would sit in Shetland up in the north in Scotland when my mum was ill. I was up there for quite a long time. And it gets pretty grim in the winter, like imagine bleak landscape, lots of bog, several sheep. And I'm sitting there thinking, what
Hmm.
am I doing? Like I'm 23, this sucks. And I would go on like the early version of Google Street View and just try and, it would load like this slowly, right? And walk through the streets of two cities, Odessa and New York City, and think well, maybe one day I'll get to see one of them. So when I did get to Odessa, I was just so happy, and there was so much going on. There was this real feeling of solidarity, of like collective effort, and people being really involved in this huge collective fight. Which they were kind of shocked that they were managing it at that point, and so was the rest of the world, right? No one really thought Ukraine could at that time. So then I went to Kharkiv, and then from then on, I hung around and I did a very kind of from the ground reporting where I didn't really have a fixer or a translator, or because I didn't really need one, or driver or anything. So I'd kind of get lifts with people and get lots of trains, and it's just me and my rucksack and my pals. And that meant that I got to have a lot of long conversations with people that helped me understand a lot of the context and the history. And I could put all of that into a book in the end.
That is why your book is so beautiful. It is talking to the
Thank you.
people along the way. And my feeling, I've been traveling since January, and everything about my travels is about the small conversations that I have everywhere I go. And
Yeah.
maybe because I've been a reporter for a million years, they sort of sniff it out. But the things people tell you and the little bits of intel, whether you're at a cash register or a market or wherever you are, I find it to be just quite beautiful and also really amazing if you're trying to understand culture. And
Hmm.
I know that you love Odessa, so we may as well just talk a little bit about that. Again, our mutual friend Zarina Zabriskie does too. And can you give our viewers just a sampling of what it's like and how devastating it is that these beautiful historic places are completely under siege? Not necessarily Odessa full time, but certainly it's being targeted,
Hmm.
as you know, from firsthand reporting.
Yeah, it is. It's totally unique. I mean, there's nowhere like Odessa because it was this famous cosmopolitan port city on the Black Sea. It was a very Jewish city until the Nazis invaded and killed 30,000 people,
Wow.
Jewish Odessans. But it's still got this kind of Yiddish jokes and slang. It's got this whole Odessa accent that I would try and figure out. I had an Odessan boyfriend for a while who I put in the book, and no one ever asked about it. I think they're too polite. But, but I just thought I'd put that in because it was kind of relevant. Like I met him at the military hospital. He was a volunteer going to like collect wounded people and bring them back. So we'd both have kind of tough days and find some solace with people in wartime.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and I lived in God, I'm so excited, Heidi, because I managed to find this apartment again. I kind of lost it for years, couldn't find it on Airbnb or anything. It's like a little bedsit in the Moldovanka area, like the old Jewish part of Odessa. And it's all like imagine Venice. I've never been to Venice, but this is what I imagine. But like crumblier. like kind of run down and beautiful and faded and crumbly. And I remember going into this like courtyard, and it was spring, and there was cherry blossom hanging up, and the washing hanging up, and laundry, and like a cat with a rat. And I thought, I've come home. It was just so like, it's just
Great.
such a bohemian place, you know what I mean? And I lived in this little bedsit. Oh, and I loved it. And I've managed to find it. So I'll be going back to Elena's apartment on Nijinsky in just a few weeks for the first time in 3 years. And I couldn't be more excited, to be honest. Odessa has Privo's markets, this huge, one of the biggest surely in Europe, open air uncovered market, hugely historic. And the kind of food you get there, do you know, as a Scottish person, we don't have great food here, guys. Like the weather's terrible. And there was all this like fish and fruit and berries like I'd never seen in my entire life, you know. And so I was there for a while, like, and I would interview people, about when the rocket had hit their flat, but I'd also interview them about like what's it like to work in Prevost Market during the war. And I would kind of I was writing a lot for the Sunday newspaper, and so I had the space to put a lot of color and character in, which I really loved. It's so much more interesting than just breaking news.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. We do so much on this show that deals with disinformation and the fascist creep and everything that I like to pause for moments of beauty. So thank you so much for that. And high fidelity, you jump in.
So, as I was reading your book, I was struck by the thought that what I'm reading, even though it's contemporary, it is a memoir of war along the lines of like For Whom the Bell Tolls or Once There Was a War by Steinbeck,
Oh, that's
right?
very kind.
It's an excellent piece of work. Thank you. But what I would like to ask you, uh, we are in the war now. We are in Russia's world war. We have seen Russia attack Latvia, Moldova. They're messing with Estonia. I mean, we know, Fitso, Lukashenko, Medvedchuk in Ukraine. 20 years from now, do you think the truth of what Russia has done with their crimes against humanity, with their war crimes, with the massacres, do you think that will be taught to our children or our children's children, or do you think it will be covered up by more Russian lies?
I believe that. Absolutely. I believe in Europe. I know that's perhaps naive, but I really do. And I believe in that there's going to be a reckoning, there's going to be a tribunal, there's going to be war crimes prosecutions, because the prospect of all of the people that I know having worked so hard for so many years to gather all that evidence in the belief that internationally, surely there would be some form of justice at the end of it. Like Victoria Amelina, when she was a war crimes researcher, and instead of writing her beautiful poetry and living her life, she was gathering these testimonies endlessly, endlessly, and then of course Russia killed her as well. I have to believe that there will be some form of justice, and I have to believe, of course, that the truth will out and it will be recognized as such, because otherwise, what would be the point in everything that we do? Um, I find that my optimism increases when I can get back to Ukraine. Maybe optimism is the wrong word. It's good I enjoy being in a place where everything matters and people understand how you have to fight for democracy and you have to fight for these things that we took for granted for so long. Um, and where people are, I think, more um, savvy about news and disinformation, whereas here in the UK, in Scotland, a lot of people are being taken in by a lot of rubbish about this war, and it pains me a great deal.
Yeah, it's absolutely so vital that I interviewed the commander of the Georgian National Legion a couple weeks ago. Hi-Fi and I did actually. And he said the biggest problem with so many people in the West, and he was speaking specifically of America, is that we are still not inoculated against disinformation. And in his case, he's been fighting Russia and Russians for 32 years, so he has some inoculation against it. So the point you brought up is wonderful, high fidelity, and the comparisons are wonderful. And what I want to ask you is that we know so many war correspondents from history And we know these stories of male war correspondents. We know very, very few stories about the female war correspondents. And
Actually, I have, if we're talking about women correspondents in the war, so this is the person who has inspired me the most. This is the great big biography of Martha Gellhorn by Caroline Muirhead. I've also got Gellhorn's letters, which are fascinating. A friend gave me this book years ago, and I started reading it, and it's Gellhorn in, she in like New Jersey or something when she's kind of in her early 20s, and she's like writing saying, God, I just wish I was in Russia and I didn't have to work on this local paper. Oh my God, it's me. But there's, yeah, this book I really recommend by Judith Mackrell. So it's called Going with the Boys, and it's about 6 women: Gellhorn, Lee Miller, who people might know because of the film that Kate Winslet starred in recently, which I think is genuinely really good, Virginia Coles, Sigrid Schultz, Claire Hollingsworth, Helen Kirkpatrick. Now they were covering World War II when they weren't actually allowed to be, they weren't allowed to go, they weren't allowed to be correspondents, and they did it anyway somehow. So whenever I'm feeling a bit pissed off about bureaucracy, I just think, God, can you imagine? Imagine how
Yes,
difficult.
exactly.
And some of them, then they had to contend with their own bloody men in their lives. Like
Yeah.
poor old Gellhorn had to deal with Hemingway. Can you imagine
Yeah.
stealing her
Yeah.
commission and being an absolute,
Her husband. So
yeah.
a couple stories that I want to tell. I picked this book up in Galway at Charlie Burns bookshop. And so that's kind of why, that's where I was going with this. And then a quick Gellhorn story. My friend Ann Nelson, who wrote Shadow Network, was actually friends with her. And I didn't realize until Anne told me that first of all, Hemingway would be very jealous of her, a lot of her work. And then
It was better.
and then when she went blind, she ended up killing herself because she just couldn't imagine not being able to, see and do the things that she did, which always makes me very grateful for my sight and my vision, because it's absolutely vital to be able to do this work, being able to see. There's just so much richness in these women's lives. And two other quick stories. I'm sure you probably have heard of Bella Fromm, who was in Berlin in the 30s. Um, when she was warning her editors about the Nazis, they were like, oh, you're just overreacting. And it's like, no,
Sure.
she wasn't
Yeah,
overreacting. So in any
yeah.
case, the reason I bring this up is because I'd love very much to know, if you could just sort of give our viewers an idea, and your book of course does this, but just have people who haven't read your book yet a sense of what it's like to be a woman on the front line as opposed to a male correspondent. If you have anything to shed, or any illumination there, I think there's a lot of value to being a woman doing this work.
I think there's, do you know, people have asked me this a lot, and I keep, maybe it sounds really flippant, I don't mean to. I found particularly more frontline reporting stuff is the most gloriously gender-free zone. Um,
Wow.
I was never very girly. I grew up on a small farm, and I like wearing boiler suits and being covered in mud and doing lots of manual work. I enjoy that. And I was always treated when I was little that as that I could do all of that just as much as my brother. And I loved that. And when I'm doing frontline reporting, I genuinely feel a bit like I'm back there, because everyone looks like shit. Everyone's muddy. Everyone's wearing the same kind of almost uniform, and you're treated like a comrade and a journalist and not a woman. In my experience, I've been lucky. On bases that I stayed on, soldiers have all been extraordinarily chivalrous and just really decent, really nice to hang out with. I've never found it a problem. Sometimes I think like you don't get taken seriously by some editors, but like that's their loss. Overall, I find it beneficial, and not really a problem. Perhaps it does. I mean, in some places, I think you can talk to other women a little bit more easily than you could if you were a man. The only problem, Heidi, is that nothing fits. Like I'm 5'1". I'm not even 5'1". I'm a tiny little person, and I have quite a small head. I doesn't look small, but like no helmet fits me. Flak jackets don't fit me. And when they say, "Oh, it's unisex," you're like, "No, it's not. It's for men." And that means that the plates and stuff don't cover your vital organs. So it's actually really dangerous to have all this gear that doesn't fit women at all. And it is slowly changing because there's more women in armed services and so on. They're making stuff that actually fits us. But you know, come on, guys. Like it's very annoying.
I sense a
So
business opportunity.
I was just going to say, I've met you in person, and I picture you as being very tall. So I don't
Really?
know how I don't know how that happened, but I do not picture you as being 5'1". I picture you as being very tall.
Okay.
I have one more question, but high fidelity, you jump in.
Um, there's a couple things I want to ask you about, but I think the most important thing is one of the things we try to uh, express on this show is, to understand that disinformation adds to the fog of war, that the
Mm.
lies that Russia is spreading about things like the Azov Nazis and Zelensky's a dictator, blah blah blah, these all add to the fog of war. And one of your stories that I found kind of interesting that talked about the fog of war was you were meant to go to a place called Chasiv Yar, and you ended up not going there. Can you tell that story?
That was my own stupidity mostly. I was I was joining, I was on my, well, I was staying with a friend in Kramatorsk, and I'd found the number of this guy who did evacuation runs, and I'd rung him up and said, please, can I come with you? And he was like, it's a bit weird that you're on your own, but if you can, if you can speak Russian, then okay, fine. So he told me you need to be at this like petrol station, gas station at 7, 8 a.m. the next day. And I was duly there, but there was already a convoy about to leave, and I thought it was that one. So I jumped in with them thinking, oh, I don't want to miss it. And of course, it turned out they were going in completely the opposite direction. And it just like became very awkward because it was too late for them to kick me out. And anyway, so if we went to Siviersk, which was much more dangerous, arguably, and quite further away. And they just had to sort of put up with me. And I mean, it was an interesting story. It was evacuations of people from a town under very heavy shelling. Um, and I wrote it up for a newspaper, as I recall.
Wonderful. Um, so much of your book is just, it pays attention to the details, the weather, the flowers, the music or
Good, yeah,
art or
yeah.
seasons. And I love that. Again, I associate that with a woman paying attention. And um, you make a point of talking about what wonders music and art can work on children as well as adults, and adults needing it too, particularly in war. And I'd love for you to basically just say a few words. We don't really, I think, talk about children's experience very much because it's just too sad and we're afraid to look at it. But if you
Yeah.
can kind of share any vignettes from that, from that, your experience related to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I would always try and do stories about kids because I prefer hanging out with kids to adults. They're just more fun, they're better crack, as we would say. And I find like spending all my time with grown-ups is just, I mean, how boring. All the time. Anyway, so there was a few projects involving kids, and some of it was music and art therapy. So I wanted to write about this. And it was obvious to me that the point was exactly what I love doing with kids. I used to be a nanny, so you spend very long days with very small children. It's all about creating a kind of magic world, creating stories and narratives that they can get almost lost in, and you hold that space for them, as we like to say now. And that's exactly what they do in these. One of them was a cancer ward in Kharkiv, so these kids have got they've got a lot to deal with, and there's constant air raid sirens outside, and you close all the windows, shut out the air raid sirens, and get some musicians, and you start imagining, what does a bear sound like, and what does this sound like, and it made me very happy, and people enjoyed listening to it, and also those projects always need more support, so it was kind of a win-win.
Beautiful. Any final things that you would like to express, or any particular parts of your book that you would like people to know about, or your favorite aspects of it?
Oh, hmm. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the places and the flowers, and places for me are very, very important. And I maybe didn't realize that until I wrote the book because, as journalists, we have to write a lot and we don't usually get to sit down and like describe the riverbank. And then I had to sit down and really describe the riverbank. And it turned out I love doing that. And I could almost feel like I was literally there again. And I really wanted to
Mhm.
create, I wanted to make a book that was really easy to read and that made the reader immediately feel like they were there, and they could be like, because they can't get to Kharkiv, but they can imagine it. They can come with me, and I'll find little moments of beauty and peace and joy, and I'll explain the layers of history in the city in a way that I would if I was walking through the city with them. And then they'll be able to understand, they'll emotionally understand Ukraine, not just in a here's what happened on this day and this is the ambassador and blah, 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 but in like a really in a connection kind of way that will hopefully not leave them and will stay with them and make them feel like they're part of this fight, because we all are, right?
Absolutely. And for so many decades, Russia has been trying to erase Ukrainian history and has been quite successful throughout, early parts of the previous century, 100 years ago, the
Mm.
executed Renaissance, etc. And I'm very grateful that you took the time to write something historic and give people this document of war, while also um, writing about the beautiful people that you meet along the way. I always ask this question, to describe the Ukrainian people, and it's hard not to, um, do it with cliches, like
Uh-huh.
the resilience, endurance, or whatever. And I have a feeling that if you were going to try to summarize it in a line, it would be free of cliches.
They're very, very, very funny.
Excellent. That's
Yeah.
good. Humor does see people
Oh my
through.
God,
And I know,
Ukrainian humor. I mean, guys, do you remember those
I-
billboards at the beginning of the war that they put up these giant, like they took down a lot of the road signs and they put all these kind of propaganda billboards up, and they were absolutely hilarious and they were so rude. There was one, can I swear?
oh yeah.
There was one where they'd replaced the road sign, so it said like there was arrows this way and that way and that way, and it said "fuck off," "fuck off this way," "fuck off that way," and then "fuck off all the way back to Russia."
Oh my God, that
I
is
mean, like,
so
what kind of people does
great.
that during an invasion? Like, that is just class, as we would say here.
People that you root for. And you're
Hmm.
right, it has an impact on the entire world. Any final question, high five?
Just, you know, our audience understands that the war in Ukraine is part of a greater world war. What would you tell our audience to help them get their friends and family to understand the urgency of defeating Russia and Vladimir Putin and saving as many Ukrainian civilians as possible?
Hmm. I mean, there are various arguments. I remember someone in Romania putting it very well when I said, "Why are you putting up all these refugees in your house?" And she said, "Well, it could be us. It could be us." And I know that people across the sea, same in the UK, feel like we're isolated, we're insulated from these kind of threats rather than Eastern Europe. I mean, there's an argument of basic solidarity and sort of and peace in the world. Um, but really, it's about any semblance of an international order of the rule of law, actually. And we can be cynical about that. We can all be, lots of people are cynical about, for instance, US and British foreign policy in the last sort of 20, 30 years. Fine. I agree with them. But this is actually quite simple and quite terrifying what's happening in Europe now. And it won't remain in Ukraine. It won't remain in Eastern Europe. So it involves all of us.
Thank you so much for that. That was a great question and great response. And I just want to thank you so much for being with us today, Jen Stout. And the book is Night Train to Odessa, covering the human cost of Russia's war. It won a bunch of awards, and you guys will find out where you can buy it on our YouTube site. So thank you very, very much for being with
My
us.
pleasure, guys. Thank you.